Nobody told you this because it hurts to admit, but the truth is simple and uncomfortable. The more you try to be understood, loved, and accepted, the less power you have. Machiavelli knew this centuries ago, but this isn't the kind of knowledge taught to those who still live for approval. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, reveals something that sounds almost immoral at first glance. The end justifies the means when the goal is to preserve your dignity, your strength, and your autonomy. And the means often are exactly what you've been conditioned to avoid. Leaving, remaining silent, disappearing, detaching yourself. Perhaps you were too loyal, too available, too understanding. And yet you were discarded, ignored, or underestimated, not because you lacked character, but because you were too predictable. The appearance of virtue kept you accessible, while others learned to use the calculated use of emotional force against you. Better to be feared than loved isn't about cruelty, it's about not being invaded. Avoiding being hated isn't about self-annihilation, it's about knowing when to leave quietly. Virtù and fortuna favor those who understand that personal power is born from well-applied scarcity, not from insistence. In this video, you'll understand why people pursue those who distance themselves, respect those who remain silent, and only value them when they lose them. You'll discover why the weak hate this method, because it demands courage, self-control, and decisions based on real human nature. If you apply this, you won't please everyone, but you'll become someone who no longer begs for anything. And once you understand this, there's no way you can pretend you don't know. If something inside you awakened while listening, don't ignore that feeling. This channel isn't about videos, it's about memories. Remember who you were before the fear, before the exhaustion, before the silence. Each new video here is a different reflection of your own soul. An invitation to understand what the world never taught you. The power you seek outside has always been within you. If you feel that this journey speaks to what lives silently within you, sign up now. Not to follow yet another creator, but to reconnect with something the world tried to make you forget. Because here, every word was made to heal, each reflection to awaken, and each video serves as a reminder you are not alone on the path back to yourself. Click on subscribe and turn the algorithm into a daily reminder of who you really are. He learns early on that not all loyalty is what it seems. In practice, many people call loyalty what, at its core, is just well-dressed convenience. As long as there are benefits, favors, status, or comfort, everyone seems faithful, present, and solicitous. But as soon as the balance tips slightly against them, the mask falls. Machiavelli already warned that decisions based on real human nature are always safer than those guided by ideals, too beautiful to be true. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, teaches that most are not loyal to the person, but to the advantage they offer. That's where the famous appearance of virtue comes in. Many seem loyal, but only as long as it suits them. He observes in silence, perceives patterns, tests limits. When he stops offering something, when he becomes less useful, the supposed loyalty begins to fail. And this is not a tragedy, it's information. Virtù and fortuna go hand in hand precisely because those who understand the game are not fooled by emotional speeches, but read behaviors. The difference between true loyalty and convenience becomes clear in times of scarcity. The friend who disappears when you say no, the partner who changes their tone when you set boundaries, the colleague who only calls when they need something. All of these are classic signs of relationships sustained by exchange, not respect. Machiavelli would say, bluntly, that the end justifies the means when the goal is to preserve your emotional sovereignty. It's better to be feared than loved, as long as it avoids being hated, because silent respect protects more than false closeness. He begins to understand that real loyalty is rare, silent, and doesn't do marketing. Those who are loyal don't demand constant proof, don't threaten to leave, don't manipulate guilt. Your own loyal armies in the symbolic realm are relationships that remain even when you cease to be convenient. Everything else is an informal contract that expires quickly. True power emerges when one learns something simple yet uncomfortable, leaving when devalued changes everything. No speech, lengthy explanation, or attempt to convince can overcome the impact of a firm and elegant withdrawal. Calculated use of force here is not aggression, it's absence. It's getting up from the table when you realize you've become an option, not a priority. In practice, this can mean reducing availability, ceasing to justify choices, ending unproductive conversations, or even changing environments. Anyone who has invested in stocks knows when an asset loses its fundamentals, the strategic investor exits without drama. The same applies to relationships. Constant adaptability means knowing when to stay strengthens and when to insist weakens. When leaving, they don't burn bridges yet. They simply observe who chases after them and who remains indifferent. And this reaction from others, almost always, prepares the psychological ground for the next lesson that few are ready to hear. He discovers, over time, that detachment is not emotional coldness, but self-control elevated to the highest level. While many confuse detachment with indifference, Machiavelli would teach that it is pure strategy. Those who are not emotionally dependent are not easily governed. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, begins within one's own mind. When someone realizes that you don't react to provocations, don't beg for attention, and don't compromise your dignity, the game changes. The end justifies the means when the means is to preserve your psychic autonomy. Detachment is not ceasing to feel, it is ceasing to kneel internally. He understands that excessive attachment creates predictability, and predictability is an open invitation to manipulation. The appearance of virtue may deceive others, but true detachment reorganizes one's own internal axis. Virtù and fortuna favor those who do not act out of neediness, but out of conscious choice. In practice, detachment acts as an invisible shield. Manipulative people thrive on emotional levers: guilt, fear of loss, need for approval. When these levers fail, they lose control. Better to be feared than loved, not in a literal sense, but psychologically, is to be respected for not being too accessible. Avoiding being hated remains essential, which is why detachment is silent, elegant, and strategic. It doesn't announce changes, it simply alters behavior. It responds less, explains less, negotiates less. Own loyal armies in the internal realm are habits that strengthen independence, disciplined routine, strategic reading, physical training, financial study. Books like The Prince and the 48 Laws of Power help to identify patterns, but daily application is the true laboratory. Decisions based on real human nature replace naive expectations. He realizes that detachment prevents manipulation precisely because it removes the urgency. Those who are not in a hurry do not make emotional mistakes. Calculated use of force in this context means knowing when not to react. A simple example: someone tries to provoke jealousy, impose ultimatums, or create drama. The detached person neither confronts nor explains. They simply follow their agenda. This disarms any attempt at control. Constant adaptability means adjusting the level of involvement without the need for theatrical ruptures. Gradually, he notices something curious. The less he strives to maintain, the more others strive not to lose. Not because he played a dirty game, but because psychological scarcity activates perceived value. And it is precisely at this point that detachment begins to merge with something even more powerful, something that Machiavelli understood deeply, but few have the courage to practice. He begins to understand a lesson that almost no one teaches aloud. Strategically disappearing is a silent form of power. Machiavelli never advocated excessive exposure or constant presence. On the contrary, politics guided by reality, not by ideals, demands knowing when to be seen and when to become absent. Those who are always available become predictable, and predictability weakens one's position. The end justifies the means when the means is to withdraw in order to recover value. It's not about disappearing out of fear, but about leaving out of conscience. The appearance of virtue leads many to believe they need to explain everything, justify everything, and remain always accessible. He learns that virtue lies in controlling one's own rhythm, and fortune usually favors those who know how to leave the stage before becoming part of the scenery. Familiarity breeds contempt, not as an absolute rule, but as a well-documented psychological tendency. When someone becomes too accustomed to your presence, they begin to underestimate it. Better to be feared than loved, in this sense, means being respected for your rarity, not your persistence. Avoiding being hated remains fundamental, which is why disappearance doesn't come with slammed doors or emotional speeches. It simply reduces contact, changes priorities, adjusts focus. Personal and loyal armies here are personal projects that don't depend on external validation, a study routine, a financial plan, a well-cared-for body, an occupied mind. Decisions based on real human nature show that people miss more what they cannot easily access. Silence creates space for reflection, and emptiness is more unsettling than any lengthy explanation. In practice, strategically disappearing can be simple. Stop initiating conversations, stop being constantly available, decline invitations without over-explaining. Calculated use of force means knowing that absence communicates more than 1,000 words. Constant adaptability comes into play when he realizes he doesn't need to disappear forever, only for the time necessary to reposition himself. Whoever returns after a well-executed silence comes back with a different symbolic weight. Virtù and fortuna align when the timing is precise. Little by little, he notices curious glances, reappearing messages, renewed interest. Not because he begged, but because he left space for them to miss him. And it is precisely in this empty space that an even more powerful weapon emerges, something that makes no noise, asks no permission, and rarely fails. He learns that leaving without explanations isn't cowardice, it's pure emotional control. Most people talk too much because they believe they'll be misunderstood, forgetting that politics guided by reality, not ideals, teaches that those who control the narrative aren't always those who talk the most, but those who react the least. Machiavelli understood that the end justifies the means when the means are to preserve internal power. Lengthy explanations reveal weakness, create loopholes, and offer material for emotional counterattacks. An appearance of virtue pushes many to justify themselves, to try to seem good all the time. He realizes that well-positioned silence is more elegant and more feared than any inflammatory speech. Better to be feared than loved here means being respected for not exposing oneself emotionally. Silence is mental warfare because it forces the other person to deal with their own anxiety. When you don't respond, don't fight back, don't defend yourself, the other person's mind begins to fill in the empty spaces. Avoiding being hated remains essential, which is why silence isn't accompanied by explicit contempt, sarcasm, or aggression. It simply doesn't offer fuel. Your own loyal armies in this field are self-control and emotional discipline. Decisions based on real human nature show that most people need a response to feel in control. When they don't receive one, they become uncomfortable. The calculated use of force is precisely that. Not reacting is an action. Virtù and fortuna favor those who understand that silence is not the absence of a message, but a coded message. In practice, The power of silence appears in small actions, not responding immediately, not justifying a no, not engaging in unproductive discussions. Constant adaptability allows one to adjust the level of silence according to the context, without theatrical exaggeration. A simple example: someone provokes, expecting an emotional reaction. He reads, understands the intention, and moves on with his day. Another example: an unfair demand arises. Instead of over-explaining, he responds briefly, clearly, and ends the conversation. This dismantles any attempt at emotional domination. Gradually, he realizes that silence creates an aura of mystery and authority. People begin to measure their words, to hesitate before attacking. And when silence begins to generate discomfort in others, a curious psychological phenomenon inevitably arises, which explains why many pursue exactly what they choose to distance themselves from. He begins to see an almost universal pattern. People rarely value what is always available. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, shows that human value, like economic value, responds to scarcity. Machiavelli would understand this clearly. When something is too abundant, it loses symbolic weight. The end justifies the means when the means is to withdraw presence to restore value. Those who withdraw don't beg, don't pressure, don't demand recognition. They simply leave a void. The appearance of virtue leads many to believe they need to constantly prove their worth, but virtue lies precisely in not offering too much. When he withdraws, something curious happens. The other begins to review memories, gestures, moments. Fortune tends to smile on those who understand that well-applied absence generates reflection. The law of scarcity operates at the most primitive level of the mind. The human brain associates what is rare with what is valuable. Better to be feared than loved here means being desired for lack, not for insistence. Avoiding being hated remains the rule, so distancing oneself isn't accompanied by attacks, demands, or explicit games. He simply moves on. His own loyal armies come into play when he fills his time with personal growth, training, studies, projects, investments in himself. Decisions based on real human nature show that no one chases after what never seemed about to leave. When he distances himself, the other feels the loss even before admitting it. Calculated use of force is letting the other's mind do the work alone. In practice, this manifests itself predictably. Messages reappear, invitations arise, curiosity grows. Not because he provoked it, but because access has been reduced. Constant adaptability means knowing how to maintain distance without becoming too inaccessible. A simple example: stop being always available on weekends. Another: don't respond to everything immediately, prioritizing your own schedule. Gradually, he realizes that the value wasn't in what he said, but in the space he occupied and the space he left behind. Virtù and fortuna align when he understands that being sought after is more powerful than chasing after someone. And when this mechanism becomes clear, the need arises to completely disengage from certain dynamics, but to do so with precision, control, and elegance. He understands that leaving doesn't mean destroying, and cutting ties doesn't require anger. Burning bridges with elegance is a rare art, taught only to those who understand politics guided by reality, not ideals. Machiavelli knew that the end justifies the means when the means is to preserve reputation and power of return. Exploding emotions, exposing resentments, or trying to have the last word only gives ammunition to the other party. The appearance of virtue leads many to believe they need to explain everything to seem righteous, but virtù lies in leaving cleanly without noise. He observes that those who leave in silence leave fewer traces, fewer enemies, and more doubts. Better to be feared than loved, in this sense, is to be respected for a firm stance, not for drama. Avoiding being hated is strategy, not weakness. In practice, elegantly burning bridges means maintaining control of the narrative without disputing it. He doesn't accuse, doesn't play the victim, doesn't try to convince anyone he's right. His own loyal armies emerge when he has built enough autonomy to not depend on that relationship, environment, or approval. Decisions based on real human nature show that emotional attacks generate coalitions against you, while clean exits preserve social capital. Calculated use of force means choosing neutral words, short farewells, and clear boundaries. Something like, "It doesn't make sense to me anymore," is more powerful than a list of complaints. Virtù and fortuna go hand in hand when the exit doesn't create scandal, but creates silent respect. A common example: leaving a toxic job without bad-mouthing the company, simply fulfilling the notice period and moving on. Another, ending a relationship without reopening old wounds, maintaining a serene demeanor. Constant adaptability allows him to adjust his tone according to the environment without losing firmness. In doing so, he notices something curious. Those who remain begin to question their own stance. Elegant silence is more unsettling than an emotional outburst. The appearance of virtue lies not in being nice, but in leaving unscathed. And when he masters this art, something changes internally, the feeling of owing nothing to anyone. This is fertile ground for something even more powerful than leaving well: becoming unreachable. He realizes that becoming untouchable has nothing to do with arrogance, and everything to do with psychological sovereignty. Machiavelli always implied that politics guided by reality, not by ideals, begins when the individual ceases to be a hostage to the emotions of others. Those who depend on external approval live vulnerable lives. The end justifies the means when the means is to build solid emotional independence. The appearance of virtue leads many to expose themselves too much, to constantly seek validation, to explain personal decisions. He does the opposite. He reduces exposure, strengthens his inner center. Better to be feared than loved here means not being easily accessed, manipulated, or pressured. Avoiding being hated remains essential, which is why this shielding is silent, almost invisible. Protection against external manipulation stems from simple habits, repeated daily. One's own loyal armies are built when one invests in body, mind, and financial structure. Regular training, studying strategic topics, organizing finances, creating independent income streams. All of this reduces emotional dependence. Decisions based on true human nature show that those who don't need to be controlled are rarely controlled. Calculated use of force appears when one chooses not to react to subtle provocations, emotional blackmail, or attempts to blame. Virtù and fortuna favor those who don't over-explain themselves or defend themselves reflexively. The more solid one becomes internally, the less ground external attacks find to take hold. In practice, being untouchable means knowing how to listen to criticism without absorbing it, praise without depending on it, and losses without crumbling. Constant adaptability comes into play when he adjusts his posture without losing his identity. A simple example: someone tries to manipulate him with emotional urgency. He listens, responds calmly, and maintains his decision. Another example: they try to destabilize him with silence or distance. He continues his routine. This level of autonomy creates a powerful side effect. People begin to measure his movements. The appearance of virtue ceases to matter. What matters is stability. And when this stability is consolidated, something inevitable happens. The old, needy, and reactive self no longer survives in this new territory. He finally understands that every real transformation begins with a silent death. Not a physical death, of course, but the death of that old self that begged for attention. accepted crumbs, and confused presence with value. Machiavelli never romanticized transitions. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, demands clean cuts. The end justifies the means when the means is abandoning patterns that no longer serve. The appearance of virtue made this old self seem good, understanding, always available. But inside, there was wear and tear. Virtue is born when he recognizes that insisting where there is no reciprocity is self-sabotage. Better to be feared than loved. Here is to abandon the need to be chosen all the time. Avoiding being hated remains the rule, but now without self-annihilation. This internal death is not dramatic, it is discreet, almost imperceptible to those observing from the outside. Rebirth comes with strategic coldness, not resentment. He doesn't become hard, he becomes lucid. Decisions based on real human nature replace emotional fantasies. His own loyal armies are now non-negotiable internal values. Time, energy, focus, and dignity. Calculated use of force appears when he chooses battles, doesn't react to everything, doesn't try to save relationships that require self-abandonment. Virtue and Fortuna align because he stops operating out of need and starts operating out of choice. A practical example: before, he accepted last-minute invitations for fear of exclusion. Now, he respects his own schedule. Before, he over-explained himself. Now, he acts and follows through. Constant adaptability is not about molding oneself to others, but about adjusting strategies without losing essence. This new state changes everything around it. People feel the difference without being able to explain it. Some distance themselves, others reconnect with more respect. It doesn't demand, doesn't require, doesn't announce that it has changed. It has simply changed. The appearance of virtue ceases to be a priority. Inner coherence takes command. The one who accepted little no longer exists, and those who try to access it encounter firm limits. Better to be feared than loved takes on a new meaning. It's not fear, it's the impossibility of invasion. Avoiding being hated remains present because it doesn't humiliate, doesn't trample, doesn't retaliate in kind. It simply moves forward, whole. And when this transformation is complete, the method behind it all ceases to be theory and begins to demand courage to be faced head-on. Now the question is simple and uncomfortable. What are you going to do with all this? Because knowledge without action becomes mere intellectual entertainment. Machiavelli never wrote for spectators, he wrote for strategists. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, demands choice. Will you continue insisting where you are not valued, over-explaining, accepting emotional crumbs? Or will you apply the calculated use of force and reorganize your position in the game? The end justifies the means when the means is to recover your dignity, your time, and your inner sovereignty. It's not about hurting anyone, but about stopping hurting yourself, to maintain bonds that only exist while you negate yourself. Reflect honestly. In which areas of your life do you still act out of fear of losing? Where do you confuse loyalty with convenience? Who has become so accustomed to your presence that they no longer perceive your value? Decisions based on true human nature require practical courage. Silencing yourself when you once explained, leaving when you once begged, letting go when you once clung. Your own loyal armies begin within you. Solid habits, clear boundaries, emotional independence. Virtue and Fortuna do not favor those who wait to be saved, but those who stand firm and constantly adapt. If this content resonated with you, don't just reflect on it, apply it. Observe how the world reacts when you change the pattern. And if you want to continue learning strategies that almost no one dares to teach, strategies of personal power, self-control, and psychological positioning, then subscribe to the channel now and activate notifications. Here you don't learn to please, you learn to become impossible to ignore.